Hello, and thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar on validation modernization, adopting the CSA model using Agile. My name is Kevin Bogert, Managing Member of Azimuth Compliance Consulting. Here's a brief bio of myself, just for your information. Keep it up for a few seconds, and then I'll move to the next slide. That should be long enough. When we mention people, we are talking about the typical validation team consisting of validation engineers, a supplier auditor, a quality representative, and an end user. The responsibilities of these individuals will change when you make the transition from CSV to CSA. For instance, the validation engineer, who currently writes most of the documentation, will be tasked primarily with writing automated test scripts. The supplier auditor, along with the end user, will be responsible for assessing what is usable from the supplier to reduce verification and validation testing. The end user, on the other hand, will have the responsibility for writing user stories and the acceptance criteria associated with each story. And finally, the quality representative will have less documentation to review, but will need to ensure high-risk items were properly tested and documented. Gone are the days of creating binders full of paper. Modernization and validation can be applied to three areas of the organization: the validation of COTS software, custom-built software by internal or external teams, and software used as part of the medical device or as a medical device itself. Most of what I will be discussing in this webinar will focus on COTS validation modernization. Well, we have found that using 100% Agile methodology for COTS validation can greatly reduce the time and cost of implementing validation and maintaining the software in a validated state. If your IT organization develops internal software or uses an external company, adopting an Agile methodology can increase the overall quality of the software. Deliverables are measured in weeks, not months, at a lower cost to the organization. If you develop a new device with software, or if the device is software itself, all the requirements of IEC 62304, ISO 13485, and the FDA QSR can be met using an Agile methodology with less documentation and better results. For instance, AMI TIR 45 provides such a guidance on using Agile practices in the development of medical device software. When it comes to technology, it's critical to manage, document, and automate testing of software. The soon-to-release CSA guidance documents encourage the use of automated testing tools and unscripted test scripts. We have found that companies are going beyond the automation of testing with the adoption of automated validation tools. This is something you should consider. Finally, when adopting a new process, cultural change may be necessary. Without addressing underlying cultural change, most CSV to CSA modernization efforts will have limited success. We have found over the past 2 years of working with companies that many of them start the process but end up with a hybrid model or completely cancel the modernization effort. So let's talk about the difference between CSV and CSA. I'm not going to read this page for you. You can look at it as I speak. CSV takes the approach of creating elaborate documentation which ensures the auditors have a detailed overview of each aspect of the application being used for manufacturing the product. You validate everything with a detailed test scripts that require screenshots of proofs of execution. The focus is in documentation, not testing. This model has life science companies spending 80% of their time documenting the process and only 20% of the time testing the software. More time spent on verification versus validation. Whereas CSA represents a step change in computer system validation, placing critical thinking at the center of the CSV process, as opposed to the traditional one-size-fits-all approach. With this model, that 80% of the time that the life science spends is on critical thinking and testing, and only 20% on documentation. In this case, more time is spent on testing of high-risk requirements and less on verification. Verification is the focus of the audit process. Here we see the typical validation process used in the life science industry today. As we see, there's a lot of documentation that must be created before validation can even start. The result is a very inefficient process that creates a lot of documentation but little proof that high-risk items were tested. Quality is more concerned about the number of screenshots versus what was tested. So let's compare the difference between the Agile and waterfall approaches to documenting a validation effort. The graph on the left shows create documentation as late as possible model, while the right shows maintain a documentation as you go model. The key is both graphs is the difference in the amount of documentation created using Agile versus CSV or waterfall. My preference is to use the document as you go model. It requires that you maintain the document as you work through the process rather than waiting until all the decisions have been made by the team and then documenting your decisions. Some people say this approach requires more time commitment due to the ongoing maintenance of this documentation. My experience shows the opposite. So what is CSA? Over the next few slides, I will discuss what does CSA prescribe, it advocates, how CSA aligns with 21 CFR Part 11, its principles and focus, and the importance of data integrity. CSA requires that you evaluate the regulated and non-regulated business processes. When creating data flows, you can determine when and where the human interaction will be required, and the level of risk associated with the interaction and in relationship to the predicate rules. To leverage those activities performed by the supplier, you must understand how you will use the system and what are the acceptance criteria related to the usage. In an Agile model, these are captured in the user stories. They include a sentence or two, and more important, a series of conversations about the desired functionality and what is acceptable of that functionality. Knowing this information, you can assess the supplier's documentation to determine what is usable from the supplier and what must be tested by the team. So what I say to ineffective adaptation of 21 CFR Part 11? The reason goes back to the initial purpose of Part 11. It was a creation of audit trail and electronic signature records as it relates to the predicate rule. Where industry went wrong is that the rule was applied to everything in automated system. All testing required proof of audit record creation, and in some cases that electronic signatures were being captured every time a record was changed. Screen prints were captured for everything, and the audit records were then printed and compared against the screen prints to verify the results. The level of risk is based on the intended use, and the predicate rule was ignored because the focus was on testing everything, no matter the risk, and creating document proof of testing. This is not the purpose of 21 CFR Part 11. This is not the risk-based validation. This is software testing that should be verified as part of the vendor audit. So it comes down to critical thinking and the focus on what are the high risk versus low risk functionality. Here's an example. If we route a document for review, we don't require a signature or audit event as this is an ongoing process. The document will be checked in and out and modified many times during the process. When a document is to be routed for final approval, then this part falls under the predicate rules and must be validated. All that is required for validation is capturing the audit event around the approval signature. It should be handled by scripted testing as a high-risk item. All other testing is verification of the system. When a team focuses on high-risk items and where human interaction occurs, the focus of validation is only on quality versus documentation. You create 30 pages versus 30 binders. Following the CSA model, the detection of critical system failures is earlier than traditional validation. What is appropriate testing? This is to determine by the risk level of the functionality and its relationship to the predicate rule in Part 11. With CSA, following a more agile approach to testing, peer review is a critical component of this methodology. Quality's role is a final review to ensure all the scripted testing was completed based on the associated risk of the item. It all comes down to limiting documentation by improving testing, thus improving quality. Agile's focus is early detection and resolution, a continuous improvement model where the team learns from each failed detection. What is the focus of CSA? First, critical thinking. Knowing that testing needs to focus on risk-based approach that includes the three key risk factors of patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. Next, look at the predicate rule in 21 CFR Part 11 based on the intended use of the system. Second, separate verification from validation. Take advantage of what was performed by the software vendor. Use automated and unscripted testing of low and medium risk items. Focus scripted testing on high risk items based on the critical thinking process. Third, move to auditing of the supplier versus qualifying. This can only be done when you know what is expected of each requirement. You cannot determine this using a waterfall method, as this information is not known until scripts are being written. User stories, an agile approach, requires that you document what are the expected results or what is acceptable to the user. The type of testing used is based on the data integrity requirements of the system. Using unscripted and automated testing versus all testing being scripted allows the team to focus on high-risk items. The key is a more holistic approach to validation, including what was performed by the supplier. One thing to remember, based on Annex 11, your IT group should be considered a supplier if they are developing software for your organization. They should be audited the same as any other supplier. The testing they perform should be used to determine the level of your validation effort. Data integrity requires that you understand intended use of the system, that you focus on regulated versus unregulated functionality with respect to patient safety, product quality, and data integrity with a tailored approach to each system versus a one approach to all. CSA is very much aligned to an agile model. You break validation into work cycles, which are called sprints. Each sprint has its own agreed upon deliverable. The benefit is issues are discovered much earlier and the process as focused is on smaller parts versus the whole. Checks are conducted at the end of each sprint. The critical piece is stakeholder involvement throughout the process. You meet with the stakeholder much more often, allowing issues to be resolved earlier in the process and a better understanding of expected results of each requirement. It is a team approach to validation. Documentation review is an ongoing process versus waiting until the end. The key is timeline for a deliverable system. Fully validated is measured in weeks versus months. Let's look at what a typical validation process looks like compared to CSA Agile approach. In this slide, we see that CSV is more of a plan-driven process in that there is only one start and finish point. Errors are fixed as you go and you move forward and backwards, but yet you have no deliverable until you finally test everything. CSA, on the other hand, using an agile model, has a more value-driven process with many points where a process is completed before the next one starts, but the planning begins for the next sprint prior to the completion of the current sprint. For the primary stakeholder, this means they're getting a validated system with additional capability being introduced at predetermined phases of the validation process. The value is the system is usable much earlier at a lower cost with a higher level of focus on testing versus documentation. So at the end of each sprint, you get a usable system and you plan for the next part of the validation effort and you continue until you validate the whole system versus doing it all at one piece. I discussed a lot about what is CSA and Agile. Now it's time to look at how organizations align to this newer model. Question is, how do you align with Agile? Agile is a team-focused approach. Teams are more empowered to deliver a quality product when they have more autonomy and accountability based on the decisions they make. The team's focus is on outcomes. What is the best interest of the business? Teams can quickly adjust to changes, and failures are part of the continuous improvement process. Continuous change is the norm. The teams learn from their failures and make the necessary changes to prevent reoccurrence of these individual issues. What does this provide to organization? Value in one world. You get deliverable, well-tested products at a lower cost, quicker. So who are the stakeholders? It is middle management. They are the linchpin between the executive vision and the team's ability to apply an agile CSA model. This requires a shift in a typical management model away from a top-down approach. CSA requires a shift away from documentation digitalization. The new validation effort should leverage software development methodologies and tools to be successful. More and more IT organizations are shifting to an agile development and documentation model, while quality is sticking to a more waterfall method. Validation must support this transformation effort by adopting similar processes. We see many companies that are trying to use both, and a bottleneck is always validation when a waterfall model is used rather than agile model. An example waterfall is GAMP5, where you document everything before you start the validation. A question that we always see is, why have organizations shown a reluctancy to adopt risk-based testing programs? What we have found is a fear that a low to medium risk item will not be properly tested and documented based on an existing CSV process. This leads to the next question: why are uniform testing approaches more comfortable? The quality unit believes that the more documentation is better, and questions arise when they do not see proof of testing, such as a screen print or report. If you were to use risk-based testing, what could be some of the cost time savings realized? Quicker delivery of a product with a higher probability that critical items have been thoroughly tested. Our experience has been that companies typically purchase software, then wait 6 to 9 months until they can use it. Many blame the validation as a reason for the delay. I would disagree with that reasoning. It is a process of implementation, which validation is a part of, to blame for many of the delays. What I recall is companies go through an implementation process, then they say, we now need to do the validation of the system. Right there, it shows you there's a process problem, and the validation team and quality department are the fall guys for bad processes. Implementation and validation are treated as two different projects, when in fact, it should be one. An agile approach forces this to become a single process. What needs to be considered? A dialogue with your quality partners. Trust must be established that you have performed testing without creating unnecessary documentation. Who needs to be on board? Quality, compliance, technology owner, business process owner. What tools can help your organization be successful? You should start small and build your tool chest as you go. Tools will need to be replaced as you move through the process in your validation and testing maturity progress towards a CSA model. Understanding where you are in the maturity model and use of what tools is important to your success. I will cover more of this in the future slides. So I mentioned validation maturity model. Where do you fall in this? Are you more geared towards GAMP or are you more geared towards an agile model? Testing maturity model. Do you do a lot of testing and documentation, or is your testing really focused on high-risk items? Automated maturity model. How much automation are you using in testing? Interviews, surveys, and workshops. These are some of the tools we use when we go in to look at the first three. We ask these kind of questions. We survey the people to see if they have the same view of what testing is, what validation is, what automation is. What is validation? These are all questions we kind of ask. Look at how they conduct supplier audits. Do they do a thorough investigation of the supplier to determine what is usable in the validation effort? If they don't have acceptance criteria up front, they have no idea what is acceptable to the end user. And finally, SWOT analysis, looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats when it comes to validation. We will look at all these at a later time, but in this webinar, I will focus primarily on SWOT analysis. The SWOT analysis is used heavily in the sales and marketing world. You use it as a gauge of where an organization is in adopting a new model of validation or software development or COTS validation. First, the strength. Is a team highly engaged and is a clear vision from senior management? Second, the weakness. Is an organization and team documenting testing focus, and is a team open to change? Third, the opportunity. Is the organization open to adopting a Agile process for validation? Will the organization be willing to use automated testing and validation tools? Does the quality still require strict scripted testing, no matter what the risk level of the functionality being tested? Finally, can the organization change quickly enough so not to outpace by the change of technology? Is your IT department wants to provide a new release every few weeks? Can you keep up with this release cycle? As I mentioned in the beginning, I would address the type of human resources required to move from a CSV to CSA model. Culture change is the most difficult piece for an organization to accept. You need an individual to be able to be the change agent, and this individual should not be a member of the team, but a facilitator to move the team forward. It could be an internal or external resource to the organization. To better understand the Scrum project management methodology, it's best to have a Scrum master who understands industry requirements when it comes to validation and regulations. This person will mentor your CSV project managers and move them from adopting an Agile Scrum model of project management. And Agile CSA mentors are very important to the success of this adoption. Product owners and their teams must understand how to use Agile methodologies when it comes to creating user stories and acceptance results. These are critical to the success of the validation effort and amount to the testing that will be required. A technical writer is there to put together all the new policies and procedures and to assist in writing user stories. And finally, a technical project manager that is familiar with Agile, Scrum, and the tools that are used in an Agile process. In closing, I would like to thank you for watching this recorded webinar. Please sign up for upcoming webinars on our website related to supplier quality or other webinars we offer in the future. We also have pre-recorded webinars that you can watch, such as this one. If you would like to discuss the concepts I discussed during this webinar and how best to approach your modernization effort, please feel free to contact us, and we will set up a time to discuss the topics presented in this webinar and how we can help you transition from CSV to CSA and Agile. Thank you and have a nice day.